Welcome to Doomed to Repeat It. I'm your host, Brett Thomas, technologist, history buff, and storyteller. Join me weekly as we take a piece of current news and look for its parallels in history. Sometimes it'll be something serious, other times an odd little echo from the past. History has a habit of whispering, or shouting, when you least expect it. Mostly, I love telling stories, and this is a great excuse to do just that. Our topic this week is one of the more amusing ones. It's a little less current than the stories I plan to tackle in the future, but it was the inspiration for the show, and I really wanted to do it. If you've been paying attention recently, you may have heard of a high-profile group chat fail that happened within the US government. It's a story of military communications going to people they weren't supposed to. Increasingly, in recent years, leaders from both major parties have eschewed secure government communications and turned to their own solutions. Partially, this is to avoid accountability. The Federal Records Act requires that written communication be preserved for historical purposes. Of course, that can be embarrassing after the fact, depending upon what was said. While failing to preserve these communications is technically a crime, as far as I know, no one has ever been prosecuted for it. Recently, this led to the most embarrassing leak of military information that I can recall in recent memory. In mid-March of 2025, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz created a group chat on Signal with it set for messages to be auto-deleted in 4 weeks. From a security perspective, if you don't have an NSA secured email system, Signal is generally recognized as being among the absolute best systems for private communications available. At least thus far, while clearly violating the Federal Records Act that no one has ever actually gotten in trouble for violating, they certainly could have made worse choices from a security perspective. Mr. Waltz added several other less notable administration officials to the group chat and a man named Jeffrey Goldberg. Now, Mr. Goldberg is a very odd choice to be in the chat. He doesn't work for the government at all. In fact, he's the editor of The Atlantic magazine, which is an American centrist magazine that is very much against Donald Trump's administration. In fact, at first, Mr. Goldberg figured this had to be a hoax, troll, or prank. He thought, there's no way this is real. This is somebody trying to get me to bite on a non-existent story, and just sat back and watched as the supposed administration officials debated the timing of the upcoming attacks. After a while, they had decided a time and place to hit. Mr. Goldberg decided to wait and see if that was in fact when they hit Yemen. As he tells the story, he was doing some grocery shopping and ended up sitting in his car for 10 minutes before opening up social media at H hour and discovering that there were reports of explosions in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and he realized that yes, in fact, all of this was real. Once he realized that the chat was real, he notified the members of the chat that he had been lurking and then left. Some people question why he did this. While I have no inside sources, I suspect he feared being prosecuted for knowingly receiving classified information by the notoriously vindictive Trump administration. Subsequently, he published the story, initially with operational details redacted. After the Trump administration first claimed he was making it all up, Mr. Goldberg subsequently published everything he'd seen. The Trump administration denied it, then denied that it was a problem, then investigated and said, no, there was no actual problem here, and punished no one. President Trump is rumored to have wanted to fire Waltz for the error. He was reportedly especially annoyed that the secretary had Jeffrey Goldberg's contact info in his phone to begin with. However, the President Trump decided that he did not want to give the Atlantic bragging rights for having taken the scalp of a senior administration official just weeks into the term. Now that we have the current event, I thought it might be fun to look at some parallel cases of military or government communication going awry. Thankfully for U.S. soldiers in this case, the misrouted communication did not fall into the hands of the military enemy, and it did not have battlefield consequences. Unsurprisingly, the noteworthy cases we remember from history often did not turn out so well, which is probably why we remember them. The first case that we're going to consider is that of the Battle of Metaurus in 207 BCE. This was in the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage. Carthage was a northern African city located in modern-day Tunisia. If you'll recall, that's the famous war where the brilliant Carthaginian commander Hannibal snuck a whole army complete with war elephants through Spain and over the Italian Alps, which were generally at the time considered to be impassable. And the first Rome knew about it was when they started marauding around the northern part of what is now Italy, trying to draw Rome out for battle. They did so, and Hannibal defeated the Romans, badly, 3 times. At the Battle of Trebia, the Battle of Lake Trasimene, and absolutely decisively and devastatingly at Cannae, which is certainly the worst defeat of the Roman Republic's armies. Hannibal managed to encircle something like 60,000 men. Of course, casualty counts on ancient battlefields are often stretched, but this one is believed by most historians. And 3,000 or so of them escaped. The rest were ruthlessly killed. After this, the Romans decided they would not, in fact, try to tackle Hannibal head on. Hannibal then spent the next decade breaking things around the Italian peninsula, trying to bait Rome into attacking him again. While he managed to raise local allies from the population, he really needed bigger reinforcements. And his brother Hasdrubal Barca was bringing them. Following in Hannibal's footsteps, he crossed the Alps from Spain with some 35,000 men. He had an easier time of it than his brother because his brother had warned him about the challenges involved. When he descended into northern Italy, he sent messengers to coordinate with Hannibal and also to figure out where his brother exactly was. Unfortunately for him, the Romans intercepted one of the messengers near Tarentum. Recognizing the importance, they immediately forwarded the messages to Rome's co-consuls, essentially a one-year term co-presidency that led the Roman Republic. The consuls, Nero, not that one, and Livius, recognized the importance. Nero quickly raised an army of 7,000 hand-picked elite forces and marched north to meet up with the roughly 35,000 men Livius already had there. Their combined armies caught Hasdrubal with his pants down. He had no idea they were there. At the Battle of Metaurus, the combined Roman army killed about 10,000 men and captured even more. Hasdrubal himself was killed in the battle, and the rest of his army melted away. There would be no reinforcements for Hannibal. It took many more years, but eventually the Roman consul Scipio, one of the few survivors of Cannae, took a small army to invade northern Africa and take the pain of war to the Carthaginians. Hannibal was forced to return to Africa to defend his homeland, where Scipio easily and finally defeated him at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE with a numerically inferior force. Asked by Scipio later who he thought the greatest generals of all time were, Hannibal replied, Alexander the Great, Pyrrhus, and me. Scipio, irritated, said, And where would you rank yourself if you'd won at Zama? Hannibal replied, In that case, I would have ranked myself ahead of Alexander. A backhanded compliment saying that the only reason he wasn't the greatest general in history was because he'd been unable to best Scipio. The next historical case of a war message being intercepted that we're going to look at was from the U.S. Civil War, Battle of Antietam in 1862. The Union Army was led by General McClellan, today mostly remembered for his ineffectiveness. While a competent peacetime leader, he was only overly cautious in war and often failed to exploit the enemy's failure or waited too long to take advantage of quickly changing conditions. The Confederate General Robert E. Lee was planning an attack on Union forces near Antietam, Maryland. McClellan had previously advanced to the outskirts of the Confederate capital, Richmond, but again his hesitancy had allowed Lee to outmaneuver him and push him back. Had McClellan taken Richmond, the war might have ended right there, and President Lincoln was well aware of this. They were now fighting only 60 miles from the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C., which, as you might imagine, was making the populace nervous. Lee drew up a plan of attack called Special Order 191 on September 9th. Its intent was to unify his forces for an attack around September 13th. He then had trusted staff officers make 7 copies so that they could be distributed to his top generals. Most found their intended recipient, and those recipients understood how important it was to keep this information safe. General Stonewall Jackson burned his, and General Longstreet claims to have eaten his. However, the one addressed to General D.H. Hill never made it to its recipient. We don't know exactly how it got there, but around noon on September 13th, a Union soldier found in the remains of a Confederate camp an envelope. And inside the envelope were 3 cigars and Special Order 191. Corporal Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Infantry immediately recognized the importance of his discovery and reported it to his sergeant, John Bloss. History does not formally record what happened to the cigars, but it's widely presumed that Corporal Mitchell and Sergeant Bloss enjoyed at least one each. General McClellan received this letter later that day and immediately was delighted. He triumphantly telegraphed President Lincoln, I have the whole rebel force in front of me, but I am confident and no time shall be lost. I think Lee has made a great mistake and he will be severely punished for it. From Lee's perspective, his original plan, reunify his forces by September 13th, was behind schedule. On the 14th, General J.E.B. Stuart informed Lee that the Union Army was moving quickly and certainly towards where they'd been planning on all meeting up, and Lee knew that the enemy had his plans. He shifted to rapidly reunify his forces as fast as he could before the attack he knew was coming. McClellan, for his part, couldn't stop being McClellan. He fretted he was walking into a trap, that the plans were fake and had been planted. He delayed longer than he could have, allowing Lee to successfully unify his army instead of being able to split them into pieces that the Union Army could defeat in detail. The battle actually occurred on September 17th. It was and remains the single bloodiest day in American history. McClellan's 87,000 men fought a numerically inferior 40,000-man rebel force. But as always, he did not act decisively. He did manage to make withdraw, ending the attack on the north, which was politically important for Lincoln. But despite 23,000 casualties between the sides, the result was indecisive. Lincoln spun this as a victory publicly, and the people in Washington were awfully glad that Lee was no longer an immediate threat. It put wind in the sails of the anti-slavery Republicans for the upcoming congressional elections, and emboldened President Lincoln to make the Emancipation Proclamation. However, privately, Lincoln was frustrated that McClellan had the opportunity to destroy the Confederate Army and perhaps end the war in a stroke, and had been too timid to do it. Lincoln went on to fire him in November, though it took a while to find the man who would win the war. Burnside, Hooker, and Meade each got their shot before finally Lincoln found what he wanted in Ulysses S. Grant. Funnily enough, in this case, losing the message probably had larger consequences for the side that found it than the side that lost it, as failure to exploit the opportunity finally led to a shift in leadership that had been long needed. Our final intercepted message is not a dramatic battlefield communique, but it had absolutely enormous consequences for World War I. The war was a famous and terrible stalemate. The origins are far too large to get into in any detail right now, but a web of alliances across Europe suddenly turned into a continent-wide war in 1914. In broad strokes, Germany invaded France, intending to defeat them quickly and then pivot to defeat France's ally Russia on the eastern side, correctly figuring that it would take Russia some time to mobilize their forces for war. France's ally, the United Kingdom, came to their aid, and by the end of the year it had settled down into a bloody trench warfare. Advances were non-existent, and millions of young men were thrown into the meat grinder. Military leaders on both sides came to the conclusion that the only way to win the war was simply to exhaust their opponents, run them out of men, materiel, food, until they just collapsed. As part of this bloody calculus, they stopped trying for the elusive breakthrough and instead started simply trying to kill as many of the other side's men as possible. Great Britain and France were able to keep themselves supplied because the UK had the most powerful navy in the world. Its far-flung colonies supplied men and supplies, but a huge amount of support came from the US over the Atlantic Ocean. Not for free, of course. American businesses saw a profit opportunity in the desperate defense of France, and America was officially neutral. People in the US very much saw the war as more of a them problem and were not interested in getting involved. Germany realized by 1915 that with a resupply from America, France and the UK would eventually win the war of attrition. It needed to put a stop to it, but ideally without antagonizing the US so much that they came to help in the war. Unable to confront the Royal Navy on the surface of the sea, they invested in submarines, U-boats, and announced that they would begin unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Prior to this, they would only have attacked unannounced military ships or ships clearly carrying military cargo and destined for the UK or France. Their doctrine allowed sinking civilian merchant ships, but only after announcing their intention and allowing the passengers and crew to safely escape the ship. Obviously, once those ships were traveling with military escort, you couldn't stop them much with a lone wolf submarine under those rules of engagement. They published full-page newspaper advertisements in big American papers warning Americans that if they sailed on ships bearing the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies, that Germany now considered them fair game, even if the ship was ostensibly civilian. I say ostensibly because World War I is the beginning of total war. The idea being that to prosecute a modern war, you require so much supply that the entire nation is put on a war footing. Now, instead of only attacking clearly military targets, it's necessary for victory to attack all of it. This historical idea metastasized into unrestricted firebombing of cities in World War II. But the Germans did have a goal. Remember that in 1915, if you wanted to travel from America to the UK or vice versa, you did this on a gigantic passenger liner. The Titanic had sunk just 3 years before. That's exactly the sort of ships that we're talking about. They carried passengers, yes, but they also carried freight in their holds, and many of them had civilian-paying passengers up top and arms and armaments below, and Germany was keen to stop it. On May 7, 1915, Captain Walter Schweiger of the U-20 got a British luxury liner, the Lusitania, in his crosshairs and fired a single torpedo with no warning. It impacted her starboard side and immediately caused a secondary explosion from something else in the ship. That second explosion was enormous, and she sank completely in less than 20 minutes, taking 1,198 people to the bottom of the sea with her, including 128 Americans. Obviously, this action was very unpopular in the US. While the country was still officially neutral, most people not of German ancestry had been rooting for the US's traditional allies of England and France. But this turned public opinion very hard against Germany. People began to plan for what was seeming like America's ever more inevitable entry into the war. By the beginning of 1917, Germany was increasingly worried about exactly this. Not only would they be competing against the US economy on a war footing, they would also see an influx of millions of fresh troops. As thin as the attritional balance was becoming, anyone could see that the time they had to win the war was quickly running out. The foreign minister of Germany, Arthur Zimmermann, had a plan. He got it approved by Kaiser Wilhelm II and telegraphed the German ambassador in Mexico City. The ambassador was instructed to offer the Mexican president an alliance if Mexico wanted to invade the U.S. from the south. This was an obviously ridiculous offer. Mexico was in no position to challenge the U.S. and wasn't interested in losing a war to help pull Germany's tail out of the fire. The Mexican president left him on red. More disastrously for the Germans, however, the telegraph line that they had sent the message on passed through Britain, and the British were tapping it. When they intercepted the message, they turned it over to their American counterparts, who sat on it for now. On February 1st, 1917, Germany announced truly unrestricted submarine warfare, that they would sink unannounced any ship in the Atlantic that they felt was supplying their enemies. Then, on February 3rd, they made good on that threat. Captain Hans Rose of U-53 sank the U.S. merchant ship Housatonic with a torpedo. Despite the official policy being that no warning was needed, Captain Rose was known as being an honorable submarine captain, a rare thing this many years into the war. He warned the crew of 25 and gave them time to evacuate before sending the vessel to the bottom. Captain Rose's magnanimity notwithstanding, the American public was furious. They were neutral and had just been attacked. Finally, by March 1st, the Wilson administration had had enough. They released the Zimmermann telegram and the U.S. public was outraged. After first killing U.S. soldiers and passengers at sea, and secondly now sinking our ships, Germany was now trying to foment a foreign invasion of the U.S. mainland? On April 6, 1917, the U.S. entered the war on the side of the Allies. The sinkings were important and are well remembered. I recall learning about them in high school AP American history in the 1980s. But the Zimmermann telegram is the oft-forgotten straw that broke the camel's back. Of course, with fresh troops and supplies from officially not neutral United States, the Allies forced Germany's surrender on November 11, 1918. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you have any questions or corrections about any of these stories, I'd love to hear about them in the comments section. That wraps up our historical parallels for today. Not every story will deliver a deep lesson, but some are just worth telling. A good story is a good story. At the very least, it's humanizing to remember that the struggles of the past were often not so different from the ones we face today.